Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. We're delighted to have you here. I'm Lee Hamilton. I'm the president of the Woodrow Wilson International for Scholars, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this Directors Forum with Robert Zoellick, the president of the World Bank. We're delighted to have the chairman of the Wilson Center with us, Ambassador Gildenhorn. And I understand there are several ambassadors in the audience. I'll not try to introduce them all, but we especially are pleased to have them here. As the 11th president of the World Bank, Bob Zoellick oversees the operations of one of the most complex and vital international institutions. About 185 member countries, a staff of more than 10,000, an administrative budget of roughly $1.6 billion, and of course a presence across the world. In its 60-year history, the bank has directed more than $450 billion in loans and guarantees to its members in an effort to improve agriculture, build infrastructure, and advance public health. It is an institution absolutely crucial to promoting a responsible globalization. Bob Zoellick became president of the World Bank on July the 1st, 2007, bringing with him decades of experience serving at the highest levels in the United States government. From 2005 to 2006, he was America's Deputy Secretary of State, acting as the department's chief operating officer, the country's #2 diplomat. He had numerous policy responsibilities of the U.S.-China relationship among them. From 2001 to 2005, he served as the United States Trade Representative, playing an integral role in completing China and Taiwan's accession to the World Trade Organization. He worked with ministers from nearly 150 economies to launch the Doha Development Agenda in 2001. He was a tireless advocate for advancing free trade. During his tenure, he quintupled the number of countries with which the United States had free trade agreements, completing or enacting free trade agreements with Jordan, Chile, Singapore, Bahrain, and others. During the presidencies of Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, he served with Secretary James Baker at the Treasury Department, the State Department, and the White House. He was also the lead U.S. official in the 2+4 process of German unification, work for which he received Germany's Knight Commander's Cross. He's also had an impressive career in the private sector. In the 1990s, he spent 4 years as executive vice president at Fannie Mae and more recently served in several capacities in leadership roles at Goldman Sachs. He's a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Swarthmore College, holds a JD degree from Harvard Law School, and a master's in public policy from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He's a recipient, of course, of a long list of awards, including the highest honors bestowed by the Treasury and State Departments. He has the Department of Defense Medal for Distinguished Public Service and many others. He had the very good judgment to be born in the Middle West. He's from Naperville, Illinois, and it is my very great pleasure to introduce to you World Bank President Robert Zoellick, who will be speaking to us on modernizing multilateralism for a world in transition. And after his remarks, he will take several questions. Mr. Zoellick.
Well, I want to thank Lee Hamilton for very graciously hosting this speech. As all of you know, he's an individual who served his country with distinction, not only in the U.S. Congress, where I first had an opportunity to meet him, but he developed a whole separate and very impressive career after he left the Congress. And I also know that it's a particular point of pride that he's able to serve the international community through the stewardship of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I want to thank Ambassador Gildenhorn, who was a colleague when he served in Switzerland, and again, thank him for his continued service to this wonderful institution. For decades, students of security and international politics have debated the emergence of a multipolar system. It's time that we recognize the new economic parallel. In 1989, we saw the end of the Second World with communism's demise. Well, then in 2009, we've been able to see the end of what was known as the Third World. We are now in a new, fast-evolving, multipolar world economy in which some developing countries are emerging as economic powers, others are moving towards becoming additional poles of growth, and some are struggling to attain their potential within this new system, where North and South, East and West are now points on a compass, not economic destinies. Poverty remains and must be addressed. Failed states remain and must be addressed. Global challenges are intensifying and must be addressed. But the manner in which we address these issues is shifting. The outdated categorizations of the first and third worlds, donor and supplicant, leader and led, no longer fit. The implications are profound for multilateralism, for global cooperative action, for power relationships, for development, and for international institutions. The global economic crisis has shown that multilateralism matters. Staring into the abyss, countries pulled together to save the global economy. The modern G20 was born out of this crisis. It showed its potential by quickly acting to shore up confidence. The question now is whether this was an aberration, a blip. Will historians look back on 2009 and see it as a singular case of international cooperation or the start of something new? Some now view Woodrow Wilson's attempt to create a new international system after World War I as an opportunity lost that left the world adrift amidst dangers. Will this be a similar moment? The danger now is that as the fear of the crisis recedes, the willingness to cooperate will too. Already we feel the gravitational forces pulling a world of nation-states back to the pursuit of narrower interests. This would be a mistake. Economic and political tectonic plates are shifting. We can shift with them, or we can continue to see the world through the prism of the old. We must recognize new realities and act on them. So what's different? The developing world was not the cause of the crisis, but it could be an important part of the solution. Our world will look very different in 10 years, with demand not just coming from the United States, but from around the globe. Already we see the shifts. Asia's share of the global economy in purchasing power parity terms has risen steadily from 7% in 1980 to 21% in 2008. Asia's stock markets now account for 32% of the global market capitalization, ahead of the United States at 30% and Europe at 25%. Last year, China overtook Germany to become the world's biggest exporter. Import numbers tell a revealing story. The developing world is becoming the driver of the global economy. Much of the recovery in world trade has been due to the strong demand for imports among developing countries. Developing country imports are already 2% higher than their pre-crisis peak in April 2008. But in contrast, the imports of high-income countries are still 19% below that earlier high. And even though the developing world imports are about half of the imports of high-income countries, they're growing at a much faster rate. The world economy is rebalancing. Some of this is new, some of it represents a restoration. According to Angus Madison, Asia accounted for over half of world output for 18 of the last 20 centuries. We're witnessing a move towards multiple poles of growth as middle classes grow in developing countries, billions of people join the world economy, and new patterns of integration combine regional intensification with global openness. And this change is not just about China and India. The developing world's share of global GDP in purchasing power parity terms has increased from 33.7% in 1980 to 43.4% in 2010. Developing countries are likely to show robust growth rates over the next 5 years and beyond. Sub-Saharan Africa could grow by an average of over 6% to 2015, while South Asia, where half the world's poor live, could grow by as much as 7% a year over the same period. The Middle East region is an important source of capital for the rest of the world, and increasingly a business service hub between Asia, East and South, and Euro-Africa. Gross official reserves of the Gulf Cooperation Council countries were over $500 billion at the end of 2008, with estimates of sovereign wealth fund assets of as much as $1 trillion. If the Maghreb can move beyond its historical fault lines, it can be part of a Euro-Med integration linked to both the Mideast and to Africa. In Latin America and the Caribbean region, 60 million people were lifted from poverty between 2002 and 2008, and a growing middle class boosted import volumes at an annual rate of 15%. Tectonic plates could shift further. Africa missed out of the manufacturing revolution that lifted East Asia's economies out of poverty and into prosperity, but Africa no longer needs to be left behind. Today, in many African countries, even small, inexpensive items such as soap or slippers, basic tools or consumer goods are imported. If Africans remove the barriers to producing these goods domestically and to local entrepreneurship, while creating conditions for outside investors to shift production to Africa, then African development could begin to look very different. Unlike past failed attempts to favor import substitution interests behind protectionism, this approach can capture benefits from regional integration within global markets. What would it take? As a first step, the 80% of Africans earning $2 a day or less need to earn enough income so they'll be able to buy these basic consumer goods. Agriculture is the main source of jobs and an early opportunity to boost productivity and income. To do so, investment is needed all across the agricultural value chain: property rights, seeds, irrigation, fertilizer, finance, basic technologies, storage, and getting product to market. Since about 2/3 of African farmers are women, we need to help them get legal and property rights and access to services. With slightly higher incomes and living standards, local manufacturers can target or customize for the local market and eventually for export. To grow further, Africans need the things that Europe and Japan needed after World War II: infrastructure, energy, integrated markets linked to a global economy, and the conditions for a vibrant private sector. Today's shifts open new opportunities. As the global crisis hit, some Chinese recognized that it was time to move beyond toys and footwear. China could move up the value chain, increase wages and consumption, and expand its harmonious society. Chinese companies, in turn, could move lower value manufacturing elsewhere, including to Africa. Chinese companies bring know-how, machinery, as well as access to marketing and distribution networks. And the World Bank is working with Africans and Chinese to create industrial zones. Early investors are sensing the promise in Africa and are not dissuaded by the risks. After Lehman Brothers in Greece, investors know that developed markets can be risky too. IFC, the World Bank Group's private sector arm, has opened an equity fund that has attracted $800 million from sovereign wealth and pension funds to invest in companies in Africa and Latin America. Increased income and growth in the developing world means increasing influence. The old world of fireside chats among G7 leaders is gone. Today's discussion requires a big table to accommodate the key participants, and developing countries must have a seat at it. Now, last year's G20 summit at Pittsburgh recognized that change. But it'll take more than words on paper. Woodrow Wilson's words on paper did not realize their lofty ideals. Arranging a new sharing of responsibilities among mutual stakeholders in international systems will not be easy, but happen it must. The failure of 1919 led to countries that could not cooperate in 1929 and the start of a new war in Europe in 1939. Today we already see the strains. The Doha World Trade Organization round and the climate change talks in Copenhagen revealed how hard it will be to share mutual benefits and responsibilities between developed and developing countries. These debates also expose the diversity of challenges faced by different developing countries. If it is no longer possible to solve big international issues without developing and transition country involvement, it's also no longer possible to presume that their biggest members, the so-called BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, will represent all. And this will be the case for a host of other looming challenges: water, disease, migration, demographics, and fragile and post-conflict states. The danger of the political gravity dragging countries back to the pursuit of narrow interests is that we address this changing world through the prism of the old G7. Developed country interests, even if well-intentioned, cannot represent the perspective of the emerging economies. We can't afford geopolitics as usual. But nor can we retreat into an old multilateralism, a 19th century Metternichian Congress of Vienna solution that seeks to resist change. A new geopolitics of a multipolar economy needs to share responsibility while recognizing different perspectives and circumstances so as to build more mutual interests. Take financial reform. The world has paid a big price for the breakdowns of the global financial system and lost jobs and ruined lives. Of course, we need better financial regulation with stronger capital, liquidity, and supervisory standards. But beware unintended consequences. We should not compound costs by encouraging financial protectionism or unfairly constraining financial services to the poor. Regulations agreed in Brussels, London, Paris, and Washington might work for big banks in the developed world, but what about the smaller ones, whether in developed or developing countries? These regulations could choke off the financial sector, innovation, and risk management in developing countries. They can make it harder to invest across national borders. Lend local requirements could have the same effects as buy local. Local physical presence requirements could thwart services just as they can choke trade. Local liquidity requirements could fragment global liquidity management and add huge costs without strengthening safety. Derivatives now have a bad name. That's understandable when one remembers AIG. But derivatives are used by farmers in the American Midwest to protect against volatility in grain prices. Mexico used energy options to lock in a price for oil that pays for much of that government's budget. Financial innovation, when used prudently, has brought efficiency gains and protected against risk. The World Bank has pioneered livestock insurance for Mongolian herders, a Malawi weather derivative against drought, and the Caribbean catastrophe insurance pool. The latter gave Haiti immediately $8 million in January when its earthquake struck, faster money than from any outside source. As former President Zedillo of Mexico has cautioned, the problem for poor people is not too many markets, but too few. We need markets for microfinance or small and medium-sized enterprises, especially if run by women. Markets to move, store, and sell goods. Markets to save, insure, and invest. Wall Street has exposed the dangers of financial innovation, and we need to take heed and serious actions. But development has shown its benefits. A G7 populist prism can undercut opportunities for billions. Or take climate change. The danger is that we take a rule book from developed countries to impose a one-size-fits-all model on developing countries, and they will say no. Climate change policies can be linked to development and win support from developing countries for low-carbon growth, but not if imposed as a straitjacket. This is not about lack of a commitment to a greener future. People in developing countries want a clean environment too. Developing countries need support and finance to invest in cleaner growth paths. 1.6 billion people lack access to electricity. So the challenge is to support transitions to cleaner energy without sacrificing access, productivity, and growth that can pull hundreds of millions out of poverty. Avoiding geopolitics as usual means looking at these issues differently. We need to move away from the binary choice of either power or the environment. We need to pursue policies that reflect the price of carbon, increase energy efficiencies, develop clean energy technologies with application in poorer countries, promote off-grid solar, innovate with geothermal, and secure win-win benefits from forest and land use policies. And in the process, we can create jobs and strengthen energy security. The developed world has prospered through hydroelectricity from dams. But some do not think that the developing world should have the same access to the power sources used by developed countries. For them, thinking this is as easy as flicking a switch and letting the lights burn in an empty room. We must take care of the environment, and we certainly cannot consign African children to homework by candlelight or deny African workers manufacturing jobs. The old developed prism is the surest way to lose developing countries' support for global environmental goals. Or take crisis response. In a world in transition, the danger is that developed countries focus on summits for financial systems or concentrate on mismanagement of developed countries such as Greece. Developing countries need summits for the poor. One lesson from this crisis is that effective safety nets prevented the loss of a generation, unlike the Asian crisis in the 1990s. Hearing the developing country perspective is no longer just a matter of charity or solidarity. It's self-interest. These developing countries are now sources of growth. They're importers of capital goods and developed country services. Developing countries do not want to just discuss high debt in developed countries. They want to focus on productive investments in infrastructure and early childhood development. They want free markets to create jobs, higher productivity, and growth. Many are exploring how to use innovations and efficiency of private markets to help provide and maintain public sector infrastructure and services. But modernizing multilateralism isn't all about developed countries learning to adapt to the needs of rising powers. With power comes responsibility. Developing countries need to recognize that they are now part of the global architecture. They have an interest in healthy, dynamic, and flexible international systems for finance, trade, movement of ideas and people, the environment, and strong multilateral institutions. We need to find points of mutual advantage, making reciprocal gain possible. What does this changing world mean for development? Development is no longer just north-south. It is south-south, even south-north, with lessons for all with open minds. It's a conditional cash transfer program in Mexico being studied around the world. It's Indians in Africa explaining the so-called white revolution that boosted milk production. It's a new world where developing countries are not only recipients but providers of aid and expertise. Nor is it about ideological panaceas, blueprints, or one-size-fits-all. In a multipolar economy, development is about pragmatism, learning from experience, recognizing how markets and business opportunities change, sharing ideas and connecting knowledge, just as we connect markets across innovative networks. Nor is the future of development only about old concepts of aid. The sovereign and pension funds waiting to invest with the World Bank Group in Africa represent a new form of financial intermediation. This is not charity. This is investment looking for good returns. It's our aim to do nothing less than revolutionize financial flows to developing countries. How will we manage a new geopolitics for a multipolar economy, where all are fairly represented in associations for the many, not clubs for the few? If the tectonic plates are shifting, multilateral institutions must shift too. The crisis has shown the possibilities of international cooperation, but it's also underscored the need to modernize and strengthen multilateral institutions for a different world. It requires institutions that are fast, flexible, and accountable, that can give voice to the voiceless with resources at the ready. It requires institutions that reach out to partners with humility and respect, ready to learn from others, that can act as global connectors, pioneering a new world of South-South and South-North learning and exchange. It requires institutions that can demonstrate real results and can be held accountable when they falter. The World Bank Group must reform to help play this role, and it must do so continually at an ever quicker pace. Government and public institutions tend to be slower to change than private organizations facing competition. To address this risk, we've launched the most comprehensive reforms in the institution's history. A modernized World Bank Group must represent the international economic realities of the 21st century, recognizing the role and responsibility of growing stakeholders, but also their diversity and special needs, and provide a larger voice for Africa. Reflecting these needs, we are urging our shareholders to keep their promise to move to 47% or more ownership by developing countries later this month. But we're not stopping there. In a model unique among international financial institutions, shareholdings will be reviewed every 5 years to allow for changes based on the continuing economic growth and evolution of our shareholders, with the goal of achieving equity over time. Senior management now includes a record number of executives from developing countries as well as women, and we need to do even more. We need to work with developing countries as clients, not as objects of development models from textbooks. We need to help them solve problems, not test theories. Yet problems need resources to fix them. Since the full force of the crisis hit in the middle of 2008, the World Bank Group has committed more than $100 billion to supporting developing countries. This broke all our historical records, and I want to especially thank the World Bank Group staff who have risen to this challenge. We got money where it was needed, fast. And even though the World Bank Group has traditionally been a lender on long-term projects, our development disbursements have exceeded the IMF's crisis payments. When the World Bank Group stepped up to confront dangers, we depended on the effective and efficient use of the resources we had at hand. But we'll need more resources to support renewed growth and to make a modernized multilateralism work in this new multipolar world economy. Should the recovery falter, we would have to stand on the sidelines. So the World Bank is therefore seeking its first capital increase in more than 20 years. Shareholders face a decision to strengthen the bank group or allow it to wane in influence, losing an effective multilateral institution and leaving it poorly resourced to cope with whatever comes next. In addition to providing critical financial resources, we've been demonstrating how modernized multilateralism can work. We're building cooperation among the 186 countries that are our shareholders. Over half the resources raised to strengthen our capital will come from developing countries through price increases and greater capital investments. Agreement on this package of measures, if successful, would represent a multilateral success story that contrasts with recent stumbles in climate change and trade. Representation and resources alone are not enough. We must also be more effective, responsive, innovative, flexible, and accountable. We're reforming to sharpen our strategic focus where we can add most value, focusing on the poor and vulnerable, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, on creating opportunities for growth, on promoting global collective action such as climate change, agriculture, water, and health, strengthening governance, and preparing for crises. We are reforming to modernize our products and services, considering a new decentralization model that will enable us to apply cutting-edge skills closer to clients while gathering, customizing, and sharing knowledge and experience globally. We need global reach, but we need local touch. We're reforming to focus on results, strengthening our governance and anti-corruption efforts, including strong prevention, and leading other international institutions in becoming more transparent and accountable. We have a new access to information policy based on the Indian and U.S. Freedom of Information laws, which will be the first, but we hope not the last, of its kind among international institutions. We're launching a new open access policy for World Bank data. And just last week, we concluded an agreement with the other multilateral development banks on the cross-debarment of corrupt individuals and companies. And we're launching a corporate scorecard so we can be held more accountable. We know we make mistakes. If overcoming poverty were easy, it would have been eliminated long ago. By opening the shades for others to see what we're doing, how we're doing it, and with what results, we will catch errors more quickly and improve faster. Taken together, these reforms are transformational. This will no longer be your grandparents' World Bank or even your parents'. Reform cannot be a one-time effort. It must be a constant. Adaptation and readaptation with continuous feedback loops to meet changing realities. We cannot predict the future with assurance, but we can anticipate directions. And one is that the age of multipolar global economy is coming into view. This is no aberration, no blip. We still live in a world of nation states, but there are now more states wielding influence on our common destiny. They are both developed and developing, spanning all regions of the globe. This can be all to the good, but the contours of this new multipolar economy are still forming. It needs to be shaped. The modern multilateral system needs to fit these changes. Modern multilateralism must be practical. It must recognize that most governmental authority still resides with nation states, but many decisions and sources of influence flow around, through, and beyond governments. Modern multilateralism must bring in new players, build cooperation among actors, old and new, and harness global and regional institutions to help address threats and seize opportunities that surpass the capacities of individual states. Modern multilateralism will not be a constricted club with more left outside the room than seated within. It'll look more like the global sprawl of the internet, interconnecting more and more countries, companies, individuals, and NGOs through a flexible network. Legitimate and effective multilateral institutions, backed by resources and capable of delivering results, can form an interconnecting tissue, reaching across the skeletal architecture of this dynamic multipolar system. Woodrow Wilson wished for a League of Nations. We need a League of Networks. It's time we put the old concepts of the first and third world, leader and led, donor and supplicant, behind us. We must support the rise of multiple poles of growth that can benefit all. Thank you. Sure.
President Zoellick has indicated he's prepared to take a few questions, and we will begin. Keep your questions to the point and brief. Kent, you can kick it off. Please wait for the microphone if you have a question.
President Zoellick, thank you for a real education, I think, on the world we're moving into. Very thought-provoking remarks. You mentioned several times the potential in Africa. And I know there are groups that are looking at what they call corridors of development, taking a look at the colonial infrastructure, upgrading it, and amplifying it. Is the bank looking at that kind of thing, and can you be part of the partnership that would really invest in that infrastructure?
It's a wonderful question because I think it highlights the tremendous potential in Africa that many people might sense through some of these growth numbers but not have a full grasp of. When I traveled through West and East and Southern Africa shortly before being nominated for this post, I was struck that the messages that I was picking up were very similar. And as I mentioned in the remarks, they're very similar to what you might have heard in Europe 40 or 50 years ago. What people wanted was infrastructure, they wanted energy, they wanted regional integration because some of these markets are small or landlocked, but they wanted the regional integration connected to a global market system. And they wanted a healthy private sector. And on top of that, to start some of the early incomes, agricultural productivity and growth. So to make this work, there's a key component for the infrastructure development. Some of it, as you mentioned, is the old but also the new. In part of the remarks I didn't read, I noted that with changes in the past 10 years in regulations for telecommunications, there's been some $50 to $60 billion of private sector investment in telecommunications. And you now have, I think, about 65% of Africans in access to phone networks, and I think 450 million or so mobile phones. So part of this can be done with the right policy context. And we at the bank have supported some of the connectivity of this, not only with the policy changes, but with some of the fiber network cables, that the undersea cables coming to different ports, a number in East Africa and West Africa. But on the traditional infrastructure, we have worked with the African Union and some of the sub-regional groups at looking at, say, a West Energy pipeline that would bring gas from Nigeria to some of the West African countries, but also some of the railroad networks, which also have the benefit, actually, if you talk about ways of lower carbon movement of products, can be much more efficient than the truck system. We're also looking at the road networks. Now, what is also significant about this is combining the hardware with the software. Last year I visited a one-stop border post that we had on the border with Kenya and Uganda. It used to take about 2 days for trucks to cross this border. We worked with both governments not only to put in the information technology, but as many of you with IT experience know, it's a question of how you link it to a business system, so that the movement was done in under 2 hours, and it created a whole different of approach. And actually, we've got some people here from IBM and Microsoft and others that are partnering with us to work in some of the express delivery to try to see what lessons they've had in software and other things that we can bring to these countries. So this is a core aspect. And if I broaden it even beyond Africa, I'd say with the nuclear summit, I've had a chance to meet a number of heads of government in the past couple of days, some of them from East Asia. If you talk to people discussing the APEC agenda or the ASEAN agenda, they, even with all their growth, are looking to see how do they build the infrastructure to increase productivity and growth. One of the references that I made about learning the lessons of the 90s is we went back and looked at what China did in the 90s financial crisis. For any of you that have visited China, you see you've got this incredible road and port network. They created jobs, but they also learned the lessons of the U.S. Interstate highway system and the productivity growth that they built with those. So this is important in all regions, and if I could bring it back to my South-North theme as well as North-South, there's some very interesting ideas coming in the developing world about public-private partnerships, how to run them more efficiently, that could also, frankly, be used in a U.S. context. Lee's from Indiana. The governor of Indiana had a political fight on his hands, but it worked out with about $4 billion to be able to lease the tollway system in Indiana. I just say to people, in an era where you're concerned about big deficits, maybe some of the developed countries can take some lessons from some of the developing countries on these things too.
Yes, sir. Here.
President Zoellick, one thing I've noticed in the data is that the developing world obviously is way ahead in the recovery of the developed world. And you mentioned the unprecedentedly large amount of money that the World Bank committed to sort of helping that transition from Great Recession to growth. Do you think that there are specific actions that you took in the middle of the mess that you could point to that could help explain why the developing world's doing so much better? And do you think there are some lessons from the way the World Bank maybe guided the developing world to act for the developed world now as it's struggling to reach the kind of growth that it sees in Asia and elsewhere?
This is Kevin Hassett from AEI, who's a good tax scholar. I was just meeting with a group of our regional chief economists today, and we were trying to draw some lessons from this. And I think the starting point, Kevin, is as one understands some of their resiliency in this crisis, it wasn't us, it's the lessons they learned themselves. So if you look, in most of the regions, the debt that they'd paid down, for some of them then had the ability to have a stimulus program without overburdening themselves. They had some flexibility in their economies. Some of them also, it depended on their exchange rate system, also had some ability to deal with some of the shocks in terms of exchange rates. Where we tried to bring some of the knowledge was to work with the governments with this investment and tried to focus really on three areas in particular. One I mentioned was safety nets. What we learned from the Asian crisis and Latin American crisis in the 90s was that macroeconomic stabilization wasn't enough. If you missed the opportunity for nutrition, and we now know in the negative 9 months, the first 2 years, it's a huge developmental critical period, you really can stunt growth for people the rest of their lives. Or if they lose the school fees and they take kids out of school, often girls out of school. These are factors that led us to try to say, well, what have developing countries done, not just to throw money at the problem, but a targeted, efficient program? I mentioned these conditional cash transfer programs that started in Mexico and Brazil, now in some 15 countries. The way they work is they will give cash to the poorest families in a village, but in return, the kids have to go to school, people have to get health checkups. It's probably done more for maternal health in Mexico than anything in the history of the country. Now, we then, part of our role is not just lending or investing, but sharing this experience, and not just in a book form, but with some of these countries, then we put them in touch with the people in Mexico to learn how do you implement these things. So what are the practical aspects? So one was the targeted safety nets in an efficient way. Now, depending on the capacity of a country, some in sub-Saharan Africa really didn't have the capacity to put those programs in place. But you could use school feeding, you could use food for work programs, you could have a number of things that could support people, but in a productive way. The second was the infrastructure I mentioned, because one of the things that's in the back of our mind is we don't want to just rebuild debt. So the question is, can you have debt in a way that leads to productive investment for the future? And the third, you'll be pleased to hear, is the private sector. So we, through IFC, our private sector arm, put together special facilities for trade finance, support microfinance, infrastructure, distressed debt. and capitalizing banks to keep them in the private sector, because if they move to the public sector, they may never come back. So we tried to learn these lessons of the past, and a lot of what the World Bank does when it works best is not just, again, use money, but how we take the knowledge and learning and transfer. Now, you asked the question that I also think about is lessons for the developed world. Well, as you know, and you've done some work on this, I suppose it's very important to have safety net programs, but I would prefer to have them effective and efficient and targeted. And there's some interesting lessons to be learned from the developing world. I mentioned the infrastructure issues. You know, I used the case of Indiana, which worked out well. Pennsylvania state legislature blocked this. And Lee will appreciate this. These become very politically sensitive issues. In the case of the one in Indiana, I talked about this in East Asia, where people were focused on infrastructure, and the head of Macquarie, the firm that had bought the leasehold, told me the story that they were summoned before the Indiana legislature and asked, well, this may sound like a good idea, but what if we go to war with Australia? And Lee and I would have answered in a more traditional foreign policy way and said, well, Australia and America have been together every war in the 20th century, started World War I on July 4th, we fought with the Australians. But the Australians far exceeded us. Their answer was, look, we don't think we're going to war with the United States, but if we do, you can be darn sure we'll go after the highways in California before we'll go the ones in Indiana. So, but one of the things that's interesting about this, and part of the point that I'm talking about in moving away from the old North-South models or first and third world, is if people open their eyes, lots of interesting things that that one can draw some lessons from for the developed world as well.
Got a question here.
Thank you. Charlotte Hebebrand from the International Food and Agricultural Trade Policy Council. Thank you very much for that speech. Given the breadth of your experience and the reforms you've laid out for the World Bank, it's of course tempting to ask you to look at some other global problems. And you alluded to trade in particular. I wondered if you could give us your thoughts on how one can re-engage the international trade arena. And the other topic, I'll leave climate change aside, but global food security. There's a lot of talk now in light of the food price crisis of the last few years about a reform of global food security institutions. Could you speak to that topic as well? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, on the first one, on the trade agenda, we are trying to work closely with the WTO, regional trade organizations, private sector, to see where we can cut the costs of trade, and in part going back to some of these points that I mentioned about the border stops, with some efforts of trade facilitation, which again, the APEC countries were quite ahead of others in terms of developing. You can probably cut costs way beyond what you could do in terms of the traditional tariff barriers. And if you're particularly talking about smaller countries, Sub-Saharan Africa, landlocked ones, in some ways they have the same problem that some of the smaller European countries had about how you'd be able to create more integrated markets. And again, I've been very pleased. This is an area where we've got some great private sector support starting some pilots with us. It leaves the broader question of global trade negotiations. I no longer do that for a living, other than to say that I've long felt that there's a respectable deal on the table. And I think part of the challenge, having been there, is just the one that I mentioned in our area. It's no longer can be done just by the developed world. It's the developed and developing worlds together, how they share it. And of course, you've got multiple developing worlds. So the interests of some of the bigger players may not be the same as some of the smaller players. This is one where it just does come down to the fact that at the end of the day, to put together one of those deals, you have to see it as a joint problem-solving exercise. Many people see it as a game of poker where you're keeping your cards close. It's too complex for that. You have to try to figure out how do you meet the political needs of players but open up and liberalize. And you have to have the desire you want to push and break it through. In agriculture and food security, I appreciate you mentioning, and I appreciate the work that we did with your organization and others. Anyway, some coming back a little bit to Kevin's question. As you know, many people here may not have the same recognition of it. Before there was a financial crisis, there was a food and fuel crisis in the developing world. And that's one of the areas I was pleased we were able to move in partnership with other players promptly to try to offer some crisis support, whether it be seeds or fertilizer for crops, or whether it be working with the World Food Program and others on some of these school lunch and other nutrition programs. that has got to be a continued important aspect of our work. I think, as I mentioned briefly, if you think about African growth prospects, there have been different growth models, export-led, other models over time. I think in the African context, and this is an area where the Obama administration, I think, has tried to push the agenda forward, if we could increase some of the productivity and incomes, looking at this value chain that I mentioned, from property rights to 50% lost in storage along the way, if you could increase those incomes from $1 a day to $2 to $3 a day, you could really have a transformative impact. Now, there's one other little fill-up to your question, and that is the nature of the international institutions. And this is one where we work with the World Food Program because, my former colleague Josette Sheeran is now the head of it, does a fantastic job. The people who work for that organization are in the field putting their lives at risk every day. Their business model is one that was designed long ago. So basically, they have to identify the crisis, go out and get support, buy the food, buy the transport, move it. In the world that we live in, this is what we're now talking with them about, if you use some risk management tools, if you could do some advanced purchasing, you could try to use the futures market, not only for food, but also for some of the transport. We did an estimate with them, and I talked to their board, we could probably cut their costs by about 20%. Now, what happens in the international world that prevents this? Well, their funding mechanism is they have to raise $5 billion a year from scratch. They don't have a UN allotment. So, and this is all credit to our friends in Australia and some others, if they could get some multi-year funding, if they could get some uncommitted cash funding, they could be able to be more effective. Another idea we'd had is we're working with the World Meteorological Organization because you don't have long-range weather forecasting in Africa the same way you do here. Now, we have it here, but it always gets wrong, it seems, but nevertheless, you have it. And so we're working to try to set up some ability so you might know whether you're moving into drought conditions or rain conditions. And then, as I mentioned, this is where you see this as a toolbox. We have this wonderful thing we've done with Malawi where 95% of the agriculture in Africa is rain-fed. So we need to build more irrigation. But in the meantime, if it rains, you do well. If it doesn't rain, you're in trouble. So we worked with the Malawi government to buy rain futures. So if you know that the rain's going to be below a certain amount, you get money, which they can then use to try to help make it through what will be a bad year. So part of the message is, what people used to see as the old field of development is vastly transformed. We have a role in it, but we also have partner institutions like the ones that I mentioned, WFP, World Meteorological, where we can support them in a networked fashion.
We have time for two more questions. One of them will be from the overflow room here, Mr. Zoellick. You said the modern G20 was born out of the financial crisis. What has been the most significant changes in the global financial architecture since the crisis that are a result of G20 or other multilateral action?
Well, the reason I mentioned that it was born out of, I said the modern was born out of the crisis, is that some of the specialists here in the overflow room may know that the G20 was around at the finance ministerial level for at least a decade before. But what prompted it, is very interesting, was the very end of President Bush 43's administration. He had a G7 meeting at the time of our annual meeting in the fall of 2008. And he recognized that group wasn't an appropriate group to really talk about the crisis. And so he and his colleagues at the White House decided to speak to the G20 finance ministers. That led to a summit in Washington, then, of course, the London summit in Pittsburgh. And one of the things you're seeing is now the Canada G7 summit this June will be kind of overlap with the G20 with Korea, and then Korea will host one later. In terms of policy, as I mentioned in the remarks, in a point of crisis, the world stepped up pretty effectively and put in more crisis resources for the IMF, which is kind of a backstop for the system. They urged us to do some of the things that we've done. In fact, they had urged all the development banks to try to commit $100 billion. We've now done that ourselves. And in doing so, I think tried to reassure financial markets at that stage. They then tried to set the groundwork for the next question. So some of the topics you see debated in the paper about the need to have cooperation in financial regulation and supervision. one of the issues that I've also been trying to flag for people is the nature of this recovery is one where you will see a multi-speed. You can already see pretty good growth in East Asia. In some ways, they're running into the risks of asset price bubbles. With a multi-speed recovery, you're going to have different policies and changes. Some of these will affect when people increase interest rates, how this affects their exchange rates. This will make it more complicated. And part of my message is that this challenge, again, cannot be done by the old G7. It's going to have to be a core group of the developed and the developing countries through the G20. But also, why not use the existing institutions you have and retool them? We're at G186, so there's a lot of countries not in the room at the G20. So if there's a follow-up, one uses the IMF, the WTO, the regional development banks, or us. So as I alluded to, when some people have thought about this, they think in more hierarchical models. I'm trying to suggest people should think of this as a network to interconnect, and the G20 would play a steering group, and the core answer to the question was, people did well in the crisis, what now?
Final question. Jose, did you have a question? Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. President. Speaking on the financial question, one topic that, in light of Greece's recent crisis, that has been floated for quite a while has been the idea of creating some type of clearinghouse or mechanisms for countries that are in financial distress, so that they may find some safe haven from creditors and obligations, etc., until they get their finances straight. Do you suppose this could be part of some type of multilateral architecture, such as the one you're proposing, and what would you suggest in that sense?
Well, in a way, that's what you've just seen happen in the EU. I mean, so you have a regional version of that. To extend that, one of the things that will have to happen in this global system is a combination of the global and the regional. So you saw the big debate in Europe saying, oh, we're going to do it ourselves. And eventually there is a role for the IMF in terms of trying to help the country put together the policies, frankly, take some of the political tension of those policies, also provide financial support. So what you're seeing is this evolution of how the regional and the global will connect together. You'll see this in East Asia. After the East Asian crisis, there was something called the Chiang Mai Initiative, which allowed a number of the East Asian countries to put together resources. At the time that it was getting forward, some in the U.S. and others were worried it would avoid the IMF. Well, now you can again see the interconnections. But having said that, you then have to look at the underlying economic issue. And since you focused on the debt question, in the case of Greece, for example, this can lower the price, it allow them to have access to the market, lower the price of the debt. But you still have the fundamental underlying issues. They have a currency that's fixed through the euro. So they can't devalue their currency, as some have done in that similar situation. So as to, if their problem is one of competitiveness, which is what happened with some of the southern tier countries, they're going to have to run some pretty difficult policies to lower wages and prices. And that's why I think this is a very important step, but the larger international system isn't done with this yet. And therefore, again, going back to my remarks, you need a system that has got different aspects of the network to try to manage this over time. And part of my other message, though, is that as important as Greece has been to the European Union, many of the countries that I work with every day don't want the world only focusing on the developed country problems. And frankly, the developing countries are looking like they're often some pretty good opportunities, so it may be worthwhile focusing on them too.
Well, this has been a marvelously informative hour. Let's express our thanks to the President. I'll ask you to remain seated while President Zoellick exits. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks, Steve.
Pleasure to see you.
Oh, this way?
That's okay. Just going up this way.